Hi everyone, I'm back with another tutorial. Today we're going to be doing some scripting for UI elements, and most of this will be in Unity, but today I'm actually going to start in Photoshop. When you're working with user interface, it's important to understand how your UI elements are being stretched and scaled. And if you just start off with a background image, it can be a little bit difficult, especially for programmers, to tell if there is any stretching happening. So I'm going to create a placeholder background image, which I'm going to use to determine if any stretching is happening on my image when I set things up. So most people play video games in 1920 by 1080 resolution. This is the most common. So I'm going to set that as my pixels for this background image. So 1920 by 1080. Then I'm just going to create that new image. You can use whatever background color you want. I'm going to unlock this layer so I can add a overlay to it. So I'm going to double click on this layer and choose pattern overlay. And there are a few different overlays that come by default with Photoshop. And in particular, though, we want something that will be easy to tell if it's being scaled or stretched. So this one here would be a reasonable one to work with. This grid overlay also is a good one to work with. I'm going to scale it so that it as closely as possible so that the grid fills the hole all the way to the edges. So I'm going to set this to 500% so it fills all the way to the edge. Now I'm just going to save this image as a PNG. So do save as and select PNG from the list. You want to make sure that you're definitely not using a Photoshop file. Those files are very large, and even though Unity will allow you to import it and use it as a texture, it is not a good approach to use. So I'll call this background test, and I will save it to my pictures. Then I'm going to go into Unity, and I'm going to bring in that image that I just saved. So I'll go and find my background test, drag it into Unity, and by default it comes in as a texture. In order to use it in the UI, we need to change the texture type from the import settings. So with the image selected in my folder, I'm going to go to the default dropdown and change this to Sprite, 2D, and UI. This will allow me to use it as a UI element. And I'll just hit apply. And you can tell when it's been switched to a UI element because it gets this little over arrow like this. So I know now that this can be used as a UI element. So I'm just going to be working in the sample scene for today, and this is basically going to be my start screen. And I'm going to create a new UI element. I'm going to create a panel first, and if we zoom out, we can see the canvas object that was created. If you have anything in your scene, you'll notice that your scene is very small and it's in this small little area down here, and the canvas is this big, large object that exists way outside of your scene. The canvas is rendered by its own camera, so it does not need to be placed in the scene with other elements. If you are doing something for VR or something where you want to have UI elements in the scene, you can do that by changing your screen space from overlay to world space. But for now, I'm just going to be creating a regular UI, so I'm going to keep this set to a screen space overlay. The other thing that I want to change while I'm in the settings is this scale mode. The default is constant pixel size, which means it will not scale for larger screens at higher resolutions, and I actually do want this to scale. So I'm going to set this to scale with screen size. So this will allow me to play it at different resolutions. So if someone was playing on an older monitor, it would scale properly, or if they're playing on a phone or a tablet, which generally have different resolutions from monitors. The reference resolution, I generally like to use the same resolution that I am working with for my background image so that I know that the resolution that I'm creating art assets for will be scaled appropriately when it's scaled up or down. So I'm going to change this reference resolution to 1920 by 1080. This match width or height and the slider below it, this determines what it's using when it scales, and you can use either width or height. I recommend playing around with it to see what different results you get and which one makes the most sense for your UI elements. But I'm going to set it right halfway in between the two, so it's half based on width and half based on height that it is using for its rescaling. So now I'm going to select this panel, and I can see that it is set to stretch. And what this means is that regardless of what screen size it's being used for, it will always fill the entire screen. So I'm going to go to my game window just so I can see that in action. So right now it's set to free aspect ratio, which means I can drag the window and I can see the gray tint is covering the whole window no matter the size of the screen. Now if you set this to center from this drop down here, then it's no longer going to stretch with the screen. So I can see that if I expand my screen, I get some buffer space on the edges. What I want to do actually is, for this panel, I'm going to use the grid image that I created in Photoshop. You can just drag that to the source image slot. Now I can see that I have this grid here. If you set it to set native size, it will use the resolution of the image to set the size of this object in the scene, and you can see that here with this 1920 by 1080, and currently it is set to position 0, 0 for the X and Y. If I was to set this now to stretch, so it should fill the entire screen, you can see that it has numbers here for left, top, right, and bottom. These are actually the buffer, basically how many pixels from the edge. So if you set this to 0 on all of the edges, then it will be stretched all the way to the edges of the screen. And if you drag the window so you can see it at different sizes, you can now see this grid has some stretch happening. Since these were perfect squares before, you can now see these are rectangles. If we set our game window to 16 by 9, which is the aspect ratio of 1920 by 1080. Now we can see that they are perfect squares again. So what I would recommend for a background image, it depends a little bit on what you're using. If you're using something that just has a pattern or a solid color or a gradient, having it stretch might make sense. However, if you're using something that it is noticeable when it's being stretched, then what you actually want to do is set it to center, and you want it to be, most likely you want it to be larger than your actual screen. So if you are anticipating having people play it on iPads, they have more space at the top than they do on the sides, versus if you have it on a mobile device. Some mobile devices are longer, so they would have more pixels on the edge here. So one option is to just scale your image, and you'd want to actually create it as a larger image in Photoshop, but just to show as an example, I'm going to scale it up. And like I said, you'd want to actually make a larger image in Photoshop rather than scaling it this way. But if I make it larger like this so I can see in the game window, I can select different aspect ratios, and I can see that the grid stays as perfect squares, but until I get into some of these taller aspect ratios, I mostly have my image filling the entire screen. So since I can get to a point where it is going off the screen at the top, I might actually want to make it a little bit larger. And I can test it at a few different aspect ratios and make sure that it is working at all of them. Another option is to have it scaled so that it fills the screen properly at your desired aspect ratio. And then set the camera background color to something that makes sense rather than using the skybox. So if we set this to solid color, and if we choose black, for example, or very dark bluish gray might work a little bit better. Now, if we use different aspect ratios, we can see that we have a border at the top and bottom, which is sometimes a better solution than dealing with stretching. So this might be an option that works for your image. So these are just a few different ways that you can handle it. The way that I'm going to handle it is this third and final way, where I have a solid background color for my camera, and I have my image that is the correct size for my target aspect ratio and resolution. So the next thing I want to add to this is a start button. So I'm going to go to UI and create a button. And I can see that my button by default is very small. That's because I set my target aspect ratio to or my target resolution rather, to 1920 by 1080. So now my button is very small. So if I want to make it larger, what I'd want to do is change the width and height of the actual button itself. So I might make this 200 by 80. And then I also want to change the text, but rather than scaling the text up, what I actually want to do is change the font size. So I'm going to change this to, let's try 28, let's do 32. Okay, and I'm going to change the text here to say start. And I want to position the button object in my scene. I want it to be in the center on the X axis. And on the Y, I'm going to have it above the center line because I'm going to have several buttons here. And I want them to stay near the center of the screen. If you wanted your buttons to be, say, along the top of the screen, you would want to change the anchor of your object so that it is bound to the top of the screen. And you would do that by selecting this one right here, which binds it to the top. You can tell where it's being bound by the dot where the two lines cross over. But like I said, for mine, I want it to be in the center of the screen. Like I said, I'm going to have a couple of different buttons for this example. So I'm going to duplicate my button and just position it below. And I'm going to change the text for this one. I'm going to have a save button. Duplicate again. Oops. And change the text for this next button to load. And duplicate one more time. This one is going to be options. And then finally, one last button, which is going to be my exit button. Now, all of my buttons, since I started shifting them down, they are all a little bit lower than what I want them to be in the screen. So I'm going to adjust them all by going to my scene view and selecting all of my buttons and the move tool, and then just drag them all up. I'm also going to make sure that the X is set to 0 for all of them. That way they're all perfectly centered. All right, so now let's start implementing some functionality for these buttons. I'm going to create a new C# script called button interactions with no space. It's important, script names cannot have a space in them. And I'm going to attach it to an object in the scene. So I'm going to create a new empty game object called button interactions. And for a game object, it's okay if it has a space. Then I'm going to drag my button interaction script onto this game object. Now I'm going to open up this script, and I'm going to be using Visual Studio for this. Now what I want to do is create some functions for my buttons to use. And in order for buttons to be able to access a function, it needs to be public. So I'm going to make a public function first called load level. And this function, public void load level. And then this function, I'm going to pass it an int so I can tell it which level I want to load. Int level. And it needs to open and close curly brackets. And what I want to do when this function is called is I want to actually load the specific level that was passed. So in order to load a level, I need to add at the very top, I need to add using Unity engine dot scene management. So it'll allow me to load scenes. And now back in this function, what I'm going to do is scene manager dot load scene, and the level that I want to load is whichever one it gets passed to this function. So that's all I need for that. The other buttons, so this load scene is going to be used for the start button and also when I get to the load button. The save button, I'm not actually going to give it any functionality right now. I'm just including it because I know that I'll want it later. The options button is actually just going to pop up another UI overlay. So the only other button I need to give functionality to is the exit button. So I'm going to go ahead and add that as a new function. Once again, needs to be public, void, and I'm going to call it exit button. And it does not need anything in parentheses. It's just going to call a function called application.quit, which is the function that you use to actually cause the application to quit. So this exit button will now allow my app to close, or my game to close rather. But this only works when you make a build. This actually won't do anything at all when you're testing it in Unity, because it's not going to actually close Unity for you. So I'm going to save that script, and then I'm going to go back into my scene, and I'm going to select one of my buttons. Let's see, which one do I have? So I'm going to start with the start button. And if we scroll down to the buttons section, there's an on-click area here, and if we hit the plus, we can add a function to the on-click. And I'm going to drag in this, not the script, sorry. I'm going to drag in the game object from my scene, button interactions. The buttons in the scene need an object to reference. So I'm going to drag in the button interactions into this slot. And then from this no function drop down, we can choose button interactions and then select load level. And since this is the start button, I want it to load level 0. The other level, the other load button, I will allow to load different levels. So now, next I'm going to choose my exit button, and I'm going to once again give it the plus in the on-click section and give it the reference to the game object, button interactions. And from no function, choose button interactions. And this one is exit button, is the function that I called it. Now for the load button, what I want to do is I want to have it pop up and overlay. So I'm going to create another game object UI, and I'm going to make another panel. But this time, I don't want it to scale across the entire screen. I want it to be basically like a pop-up. So I want to be able to see the background image behind it. So for one thing, I want it to be a solid color. So I'm going to first choose the color and set the alpha all the way to solid. And I'm going to pick a color for it so that it's not white. And then I'm going to set the buffer values for left, right, top, and bottom. So let's try 120 for each of these and see how that looks. All right, so this is going to be our options pop-up. Actually, I'm going to change the left and right to 220. So I'm going to name this panel options. And I'm going to now add some actual options to this. So I'm going to add a UI, and the first one I'm going to add is a toggle. And I want to increase the size of this just like I did with the buttons. So let's try 220 by 180. And it's not actually increasing the size because what I actually need to do is increase this child object. So this is the actual image for this checkbox. So let's set this to 60 and 60. And I'm going to adjust the X and Y position so that it is actually inside of this object. And you can see the full object outline around here. And so I'm going to, with my toggle selected, I'm going to decrease the height here. Let's try 80. Now I've increased the size of the image, the background image, and I also need to increase the size of the check mark. So I set the background image to 60 and 60, so I'm going to set the check mark also to 60 and 60. Now the text is this word here, toggle, and I'm going to adjust the left side so that it is next to the button, and I just did that by clicking on left and dragging. I also want to increase my font size here. Let's try 42. And we can add some buffer to the top as well so that it lines up better with our checkbox. Now on this background color, this text is not really readable at all, so I'm going to change the text color to white or very light gray. And the text that I want here is BG music. So this toggle is going to determine if the background music is on or off. You'll notice as I'm typing in the text, it starts showing up, but if I type too far, it stops showing the final word. And that's actually because it's running out of space on the right-hand side here. So if I select the parent toggle object again, I can adjust the width. So now it has enough space to fill in the entire text. Toggles automatically are set up to work to turn on and off. So if I just hit play right now, I can actually click and unclick this checkbox. So this is going to be one of the options in our options menu. And I'm just going to adjust the text a little bit more. I also want to have text at the top explaining what this panel is. So I'm going to create a new UI text object, and this is going to say options menu. And once again, I want to change the text color to a very light gray. And I want to make this large enough that it fills a lot of the area at the top here. So I'm going to change my width to 400 and my height to 120. I'm going to center it with 0 for X. And I'm also going to center my text. So you can center the text with this paragraph alignment down here. And I'm going to change my font size. So we want the text to be very large here. And if it gets too large, then I can just adjust my width again. So that looks pretty good. If you want your text to really show up well, there is a component you can add called outline, which helps to make your text really pop by adding an outline to it. And you can choose the color for that outline. And you can choose how the alpha for the outline as well. It's really important when you are using text that you have high contrast so that the text is readable. So I'm just going to use a black outline for this. You can also change the effect distance, which just basically changes how much in each direction the outline is being spread. I can also add an outline to the label of my toggle to make that a little bit more readable as well. And now I have text and I have a toggle. I want to select both of these and make these a child of the options panel that I created. This is important because when we set up our button for the options menu, we're just going to turn this object on and off. And so we need the toggle and the text to be a child of it. You can also add some other things to your options menu, and this is really just a question of what kinds of things you want your game to be able to have options for. You can add a slider. This could be for volume, or this could be for other things, maybe a difficulty slider or something like that. And similarly with other things that we created, you can adjust the size of it so that it fits better on your menu. You can have a drop down. A drop down, it would be useful if you say you wanted to have different resolutions supported by your menu. So you could have a list of the different resolutions supported for your game by scrolling down with the drop down object selected, and there's a list of options here. And so we could have option 1 to be 1920 by 1080. We could have option 2 to be 1600 by 900, and we could have 1080 by 768. So just you can create a few options here of whatever you would want these to represent. And then once again, we can adjust the width and the height. But the important thing here is actually adjusting the font size of the label. So we select the label and we can choose the font size here. And once again, drop downs are set up to just work properly. So the drop down already, I can select the different settings that I added in here. But you'll notice that the text in the drop down itself is very small. So to adjust that text, you would go to the template, viewport, content, and then item label inside of item. And this is where you would set that font size. And you'd want to adjust the height of the item as well. So now I can see I have these different options here. So I'm going to align all of these things to the center. And just like I mentioned before with the buttons, if anything that you have is not actually centered on your screen, then you would want it to snap to the specific edge that it's bound to. I also need to attach my slider and my drop down to my options panel so they will all turn on and off together. And then I'm going to, for my text, since this is actually at the top of the screen and I want this to always stay at the top, I am going to change where it is anchored so that it's bound to the top of the screen using this option here. So now I have a few different options in my options menu. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the options panel and toggle it off so it is not on at the beginning. And then I'm going to select my options menu and scroll down to the button section and hit the plus button. Then this time, instead of using my button interactions script, which I used before, I'm actually just going to drag the options game object. So this is the panel that I created, the options panel. Drag that into the slot. And then from the no function drop down, you can choose game object and set active bool. And so this allows you to turn a game object on and off. So if we check this box, then what this button is going to do when we click this button is it's going to find this panel and set the panel active. So I'm going to hit play and test that. So now if I hit the options button, it opens up my options menu so that I can select things from my options menu. Now the one issue we have here is we can't go back to the main menu. There's no way to exit out of this options menu. So what I want to do is from my options menu, turn it back on for a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put an X icon in the corner so that I can close out of this menu. So I'm going to create another UI button. And I'm going to make this a child of the options menu. And now I'm going to position this in the top right corner. And since I want it to stay in this corner, I do want to change where it is bound to using this drop down. And I'm going to change the width and height so that it's a perfect square. So I'm going to do 50 by 50. And then I'm going to change the text for this button to just be a capital X, and I'm going to make the font size larger. So now I have an X button in the top right corner of my screen. So now I can give this button a on-click function, just like we did with the other buttons. And then I'm going to drag the options panel once again into this slot and choose from no function, game object, set active bool, but this time I'm going to leave it unchecked. So what that means is it's going to turn off the game object that's in this slot. So I'm going to go back up to options and turn it off, and now let's test that out. So we'll click options, and then if we hit the X, it closes the options menu. So now we're going to do the same thing for the load button. So I want to, when I click the load button, I want to pop up a little overlay that is going to give me some options of levels that I can load. So once again, I'm going to create a UI panel, and I want it to be a solid color, and I'm going to choose a different color for this one so it's different from my options menu. And we're going to give it some buffer space just like we did before. And this time I want it to be a little bit shorter. I don't want it to take up the full screen. So let's do 300 as our buffer at the top and bottom, or maybe 250. And I'm going to have an exit button again for this one. First, let me name my panel. So let's call this load panel. And I want my load button. Actually, here, if I turn off the load panel so I can see which button I have selected. So I'm going to choose the load button. Where's this one? This is my load button. And we're going to do on click. And we're going to set the load panel this time. So load panel is the thing we're going to do game object set active and check the box for it. And so I don't have to create another X button. I'm going to duplicate my exit button with Control D and drag this to my load panel. So now this is a child of my load panel. Turn on the load panel so we can see it, and it's placed up here at the top because this is where it was for the other panel. So I'm just going to reposition it. But we do want to make sure that we change the function for this exit button. So the other exit button was controlling the options panel. For this exit button, we want to control the load panel. And once again, we're going to choose game object, set active bool, and leave this unchecked. So just so I can test that out, I can hit play real quick. And the exit button closes that panel, and the load button opens the panel. So in this panel, what I want to do is I want to create a few buttons for the levels that I want to load. And I'm going to use some images from another game that I have, just because I have those images handy. Just like we did with our background image, we want to select all of these new images that we imported. And you can use whatever icons you want. I'm just using these because I have them handy. So we want to change these from default to sprite, 2D, and UI, and hit apply. So now all of these can be used as icons. So on my load panel, I'm going to create 3 buttons. Game object, UI, button. And if you want a button to be just an image with no text, you can just delete the text from it, and the button will still work just fine. So now with this button selected, I'm going to give it the source image here. This is where you put an icon if you want to use an icon for your button. And you want to scale it so that it is an appropriate aspect ratio for the button icon that you have. So let's make this a little larger. Sometimes it helps to be in the game view so you can get a better sense of the size. All right, so that's a reasonable size for my button for my level selector. And I'm going to duplicate this a couple of times and use each of my level images. And I want all of these to be close to the center. And I also want text at the top of this menu, just like I had for my options menu. And this text is going to say load level. And we're going to change the size of this. And we're going to set the text to centered once again and change the font color to very light gray and adjust our font size. We can also give it an outline just like we did for our other title. And just like we did for the other title, we also want to bind this to the top of the panel. You'll notice that it's binding it actually to the top of the window right now because it's not actually a child of my load panel yet. So I'm going to select all of these buttons and the text, make them a child of the load panel. And now if I select my text, I can see it's actually bound to the top of the panel, which is what I want. So each of these buttons for my levels, each of these I want to use the load scene function that I created on my button interactions. So I'm going to select all three of them, so I can do this to all three at once, and hit the plus for on click, and then drag button interactions, the one from my scene, drag that into the slot, and from no function, choose button interactions and load level. Now I want each of these to load a different level. So the first one is going to load level 1. The second one I want to load level 2, and the third one I want to load level 3. Level 0 is the start screen, and so I actually just realized that my start button, which is also using this function, this one should actually load level 1. So if the user just hits the start button, I should load them into the first level. So the load panel will have each of these three buttons, which loads level 1, 2, or 3, depending on which one they select. Now, none of this will work unless we actually have scenes to use for those. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off my level panel for now. I'm going to save this scene, and now I'm going to create a new scene. So File, New Scene, and so I can tell each of my scenes apart. I'm going to create a 3D object in each of them. So for my first one, I'm going to create a cube, and let's put this, I'm going to make it a child of the main camera just so I can get it into view of the camera. So I'll set this to 0, 0, 0, just so I can find the main camera. And now we want to drag it so that it's in front of the camera. So figure out which way your camera is facing and drag the cube so it's in front. So now I have a cube here. So I'm going to save this into my scenes folder as level 1. And I'm going to delete this cube and create a new game object, a sphere. Once again, drag it so the camera can see it. And then File, Save As. Save this in my scenes as level 2. And then I need a third one, so I'm going to delete this sphere, game object, 3D object, and I'm going to use a cylinder for the last one. File, Save As, save it to scenes as level 3. Now I'm going to go to my build settings, File, Build Settings, and I currently do not have any scenes. There's this empty slot here with a deleted scene, so I'm going to delete that so it's not in the way. Now if you open your scenes folder, you can drag each of your scenes into this list. So I'm going to drag sample scene in first, so this is scene 0, this is my start screen. And then one at a time, I'll drag in level 1, level 2, and level 3. Now if we go back to our sample scene, and if we hit play, we can test out our level loading. So if I hit load, and then I click the second one, this takes me to level 2, which was the one with my sphere. Right now I don't have any way to go back to my start screen, so I can just turn play off and then back on so I can test the other ones. All right, so those seem to be working. So the other thing that I want to do now is I have an options menu, and what I want to do is I actually want this same options menu to exist in all of my scenes, and I also want this to be able to take me back to the start screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new script called options menu. And I'm going to attach the script to my options game object. Then I'm going to open up this script, and in the start function I'm going to add don't destroy on load game object. This will make it so that this game object is never destroyed. That way I can have it show up in the scenes themselves. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm actually going to copy the same functions I'm using in button interactions. So I'm going to copy this load level and exit button, and I'm going to paste them as new functions in this options menu. Now you notice the scene manager gets the squiggly red line. That's because we need to add at the top using Unity engine dot scene management. And I'm going to save this. And now on my options menu, I'm going to set this active so I can see what I'm doing. I'm going to add a couple of new buttons to this. So add UI button. Make sure you drag it to be a child of the options menu. And I'm going to position it below my other UI elements. And this first one, I'm going to give it the text main menu. Now, if you ever want your buttons to be actually just text without any image behind it, you can, instead of using a button, and I'm actually going to delete this button to show the example. So you can create a UI text, and this will be my main menu button. Let me make this light gray so we can see it, and bump up my font size and my width and height. And rather than having a button object, what we can do is we can add the button script to this main menu text. So if you search button in the component, this is button right here. And this will allow us to use this main menu as the actual button itself. We also probably want to give this an outline. And you can change the hover over the highlight color, which can help, especially if you're using text. So I'm going to make this highlight color be a light blue. And drag it, like I said, drag it onto the options to make it a child. And then if we hit on click, we hit the plus button. Now this time I'm going to drag options into this slot. And then from options, I can choose the options menu script, which we made just a moment ago. And load level, if I leave this set to 0, this will load the start screen. I am also going to center this text so it looks a little bit better and set my X position to 0. Now I'm going to duplicate this, Control D to duplicate, and I'm going to also use this to make an exit button for exit game. And I'm going to change the function from the drop down. So instead of load level, I'm going to choose options exit button. So this will quit the game. Now, one thing that's really important with buttons is if you have two buttons and one of them is goes over the other one, it will actually block you from being able to click on that button. However, in the UI list, things are sorted in reverse order. So the farther up they are, the farther to the back they are, if you think about this like layers in Photoshop. So this exit button, and just to make this easier, I'm going to name these. So this one is main menu. So if I were to put the exit button above main menu in the list, and if I look and I can see that the actual size of the object overlaps, and so if I were to hit play right now, I can hover over the main menu, but it's actually blocking me from hovering over the exit button. If I hover way down at the bottom, I can get the exit button. But when I hover over the actual text, it's selecting the wrong one. So it's really important that you pay attention to when objects are overlapping in the UI and what order they are in the hierarchy. So I could fix this either by adjusting the height of my main menu. If I made this say 50 and dragged this up, now they are no longer overlapping. I could also fix this by reordering them in the hierarchy so that exit is basically in front of the main menu. So both of those options will work. So now when I hit play, I can hover over the main menu or I can hover over exit game. One thing that I'm noticing is these two texts are still a little bit hard to read, so I am actually going to make them a little bit larger of font size. So let's make this wider. Actually, I'll select both of them, and I'm going to make them wider and also let's do 70. And I'm going to adjust the font size to 45. So that's a little bit more readable. So my main menu is going to take me to level 0, and my exit button is going to exit the game. So once again, I want to turn off my options menu and save my scene. Now I can hit start and I can see it goes to the first level. Now if I toggle open this level 1, I can see that my options menu actually did not carry over, even though I set it to don't destroy on load. And the reason for that is because in my start screen, the options menu, even though in its start function it says don't destroy on load, but because the options menu starts off deactivated, it actually does not run that start function from the script. So if I want it to actually run the start function so that don't destroy on load will work, what I need to do is start with the object active, and then in the start function I can add, after don't destroy on load, I can do game object dot set active false. So this will turn off the game object after it has set it to don't destroy on load. So now if I save this script and if I hit play, even though it's active in the scene when I first start, it disappears as soon as I hit play. However, now I have a different problem. You might notice that a warning has popped up in the bottom. It's always important to watch for warnings to pop up in the console. And this warning is for don't destroy on load. It says that it only works for a root game object or a component on a root game object. And the options menu is a child of the canvas. And it actually has to be a child of the canvas, otherwise it won't be rendered by the canvas window. So one option I have is I could make the canvas not destroy on load. Another option I have is, rather than using don't destroy on load, I could put an instance of the options menu in each of my scenes. So the way I'm actually going to do it is I'm going to create a second canvas object. So I'm going to go to game object, UI, canvas, and I'm going to move my options menu to this second canvas. I'm going to rename this canvas as options canvas so I can tell them apart. And I'm going to take the options menu component. I'm going to remove it from that options menu, and I'm going to add it instead to the options canvas. So now the options canvas is the thing that's going to toggle on and off. And so I need to make sure to change the things that are referring to it. So if I find my options button, instead of referring to the options panel, I want to refer to the options canvas. So I'm going to drag options canvas into this slot, and from no function, I'm going to choose game object, set active bool, and make sure it's checked. And then also the exit button, the X actually, the X in the top corner, which I did not name. This is just called button 5. So this one is also referring to the options panel, and I need to change this to refer to the options canvas and set game object, set active bool, and leave it unchecked. So now if I hit play, my options menu will disappear when it starts, and I get this new section called Don't Destroy on Load, and here is the options canvas with the options panel. And if I choose options for my button, my options panel will pop up, and I can choose X from here. When you turn off play, you might notice that the options menu actually goes behind the main menu, and this doesn't really matter because when you hit play, since it sets the options canvas inactive, then it reactivates it, so it will always go on top. And since we moved our script to the options canvas, we also need to update the main menu and the exit button so they are pointing to the correct object. So I'm going to select my main menu and drag the options canvas to that slot and choose the options menu function, and we'll do load level and leave this set to 0, and then same with the exit button, drag in the options canvas and then choose options menu, exit button. Now we can test out our main menu functionality. So if we choose options and then choose main menu, now what you'll notice is it still has the options menu active, but it has moved behind. And that is because the options menu is set to don't destroy on load, so it's actually not going to reload when the scene reloads. So we have to add another thing to our main menu button to make sure that the options menu goes away. And what I actually want to do is when the user hits the main menu button, I actually want to destroy the options canvas because a new one is going to spawn in the scene, and I don't want to accidentally have a duplicate of it. So in my options menu script, I'm going to make another public function called destroy options. And what this is going to do is destroy game object. I only want to destroy it when it reloads the main menu scene. I don't want to destroy it when it loads any other scene. So now from my main menu button in the scene, I can add another on-click function. So I can hit the plus button here and have a second on-click function besides this load level. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag in my options canvas, and from no function, I'm going to choose options and destroy options. So this will destroy my options menu when I reload the scene. When I reload the first scene, rather. Now, I also want to have a way to turn on the options canvas from my other scenes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new C# script called pop-up options. Again, no space in a script name. And I'm going to open up this new script. And in my update, I'm going to look for input. So I'm going to check if input dot get key down key code dot escape. I'm going to use the escape key to pop up my options menu. And so if the escape key is pressed, normally to find an object in the scene, we use find game object with tag. However, that only works on game objects that are set active. So there's another way to find objects in the scene if they are inactive, and that is called resources dot find objects of type all, and then in corner brackets you put the class that is unique to the object, and in this case that class is options menu, which is the script that we made for that object. And this is actually returning all objects in the scene that use this class. So it's an array, and we only want the first object in the array. There should only be one in the scene. So we can use square brackets and 0, and then dot game object dot set active true. This will turn that object on in the scene. And we can save that. And now we need to apply that to an object in each of my scenes. So I'm going to go to level 1, Make sure you save changes to your start screen. And I'm going to just put it on the main camera for each one. So I'll select the main camera and attach the pop-up options. Then I'll go to level 2 and add pop-up options to the main menu in level 2. Make sure you're saving your changes, and then I'll go to level 3 and attach my pop-up options to the main camera in level 3. Now I'm going to go back to my start screen and test this out. So first, let's check our options menu when we hit main menu. We can see that it is only creating one options menu. And now from our second level, if we choose escape, we can see the option menu pops up. However, nothing on the options menu is interactive. I can't hover over or click on anything. And that's because there's a very important thing that is required to have Canvas objects work, and that is the event system. And there needs to be an event system in the scene in order for the canvas to be interactive. So one way that we can solve this is to go to each of our levels and add an event system. So the event system is under Game Object, UI, Event System at the bottom. And I'm going to save that and do that for each of my other levels as well. Game Object, UI, Event System. And now let's try again. So now I have an options menu that I can use from the start screen. And I can also load specific levels. And then from each level, I can press escape to change my options. And you'll notice that it keeps the options that I've already set. So if I check the background music in one scene, it stays when I launch into the main scene. So if I go back to the main menu, since I destroyed the options menu game object, it actually resets all of my options from the start screen. But if I choose to turn off the background music from here, then when I load into a scene and I press escape, it keeps track of that setting information there. My exit game will also work, but since, like I said, we're inside of Unity, it won't close the engine, but from a build, it would close. So that gives you a basic idea of how to script some functionality for main menu and some pop-up windows like a load menu and an options menu. I hope you found this useful, and if you did, I hope you'll subscribe to my channel to watch when we have new tutorials coming out. Thanks for watching.